The plane ride from hell is one of the most famous scandals in the wrestling world. That day, during a flight from England to the United States, WWE superstars engaged in all kinds of sulphurous practices, whether violent or sexual, and all these incidents had major professional, emotional, and judicial consequences. It is a pleasure to meet you on the wrestling paradise to get on this plane and dive together in each controversial case that took place there. You will find out, among other things, what flight attendants accused Ric Flair of, how Brock Lesnar and Mr. Perfect almost fell 29,000 feet into the ocean, and the shocking news that wrestlers had of rape drugs, but also how JBL's suit ended up covered in blood, why Scott Hall got fired after this fight, and even how an official wanted to urinate on Linda McMahon, Vince's wife. And you'll never guess what Terri Runnels revealed about Brock Lesnar's penis, or what Michael Hayes suffered while he was sleeping. You are on the wrestling paradise, the plane ride from hell, an explosion of sex, drugs and violence over the Atlantic Ocean. Let's go. It is May 2002. The WWE just finished a tour of Europe, which ended with the Insurrection pay-per-view at the Wembley Arena in London, an exclusive Monday Night Raw show in which there was in particular a Triple H against The Undertaker match, a Stone Cold Steve Austin against The Big Show, and a certain Brock Lesnar who had only been in the main roster for a few weeks. For the record, Insurrection was the very last show before the WWF officially became WWE as a symbol of an entire era of pro wrestling that was coming to an end. So this tour was over, and at the time the wrestlers were always happy to go and do shows in Europe because the crowds were the hottest and they were always very well paid. And in this tour, Vince McMahon, the big boss, had done something for his wrestlers that was still quite new at that time. He had rented and privatized a Boeing 757 plane. This therefore meant that the Federation employees would not be on commercial flights, and that in this European tour, for example, they would travel from city to city on a plane, in which there would be only WWE staff. The wrestlers, the officials, the production team, the costume designers. The plane was entirely for them, with of course a crew at their service. And it was really luxurious since there were about 50 leather armchairs, sofas, a carpet floor, all the food they wanted, and there were therefore no civilians on board. That means there were no witnesses to possibly tell everything they saw except the stewardesses with whom agreements could eventually be signed so that they keep silent. To have a really complete painting of this situation, it should also be emphasized that on board, there was an open bar which was loaded in terms of alcoholic beverages. Just after the Insurrection show, after a successful European tour, it was time to take the plane to cross the Atlantic Ocean and return to the United States. So we imagine a group of tired wrestlers on a plane exclusively for them, with unlimited alcohol, knowing that many of these wrestlers were heavy drinkers, and all that in a rather festive atmosphere at the end of the tour, like a last day of school. To illustrate how important the alcohol consumption had been during this flight, we learned that even before the plane took off, 3 trolleys filled with normal-sized bottles had already been completely consumed. You should also know the flight had been delayed and that they stayed on the tarmac for 7 hours, so the passengers had plenty of time to drink and be completely drunk during the long flight over the Atlantic Ocean. It was something that Heidi Doyle, one of the flight attendants we will talk about again, had never seen before in her career and hasn't seen again since such a big alcohol consumption. It should also be noted that some were taking all kinds of pills at the same time, such as GHB, the rape drug which, combined with alcohol, can really wreak havoc. And wrestlers also asked the stewardesses to throw away syringes they had used. At first, there was a rather fun vibe on the plane with superstars Mr. Perfect and Scott Hall, who grabbed shaving foam tubes and were putting some on their colleagues' heads. Gerald Briscoe, one of the officials, wanted to give hugs and kisses to everyone, while Stone Cold Steve Austin and his wife at the time, Debra Marshall, watched a movie and slept during the entire flight. However, this trip would become one of the most infamous scandals in the pro wrestling world, with several incidents that would lead to lawsuits and dismissals. What happened on that plane? What makes this flight so controversial? What role did Ric Flair, Brock Lesnar, or JBL play in it? Welcome aboard. Make yourself comfortable in your seat and get ready to have some turbulence because you are going to have all the answers by the end of the video. A first case on this plane ride from hell, this infernal flight, concerns Brock Lesnar and Mr. Perfect. At that time, we must remember that Brock was still at the very beginning of his pro wrestling career. He had just been called up to the main roster and was being presented as the next big thing, the superstar who would take over from Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. And precisely just a few months later, he was going to win his first championship title against the latter. And in May 2002, even if he was only 24 years old and still new in the Stamford Federation, he wasn't someone you should bother, and the legend Mr. Perfect was able to realize it, as you will see, in a story that almost turned to disaster. In real life, the two men were friends since they were both from Minnesota and traveling together for the shows. And they had one thing in common in terms of personality: they were two very competitive people. During this long flight, the veteran, who was already a wrestling legend at that time, and the young Lesnar were going to have a memorable physical confrontation. We could hear several explanations why this confrontation on the plane started. Some claim that Mr. Perfect was telling Brock he was a better wrestler than him, while the Conqueror had still been NC a champion not so long ago. In their competitive minds, they would then have embarked on an improvised wrestling match during the flight. As for Jeff Hardy's brother, Matt, who was on the plane and chatting with The Undertaker when it happened, he claims that in reality this physical confrontation began because Mr. Perfect was very teasing with Brock and kept making jokes to him. According to Kurt Angle, for example, he threw alcohol and other things in his face while Lesnar was trying to sleep. Then he apologized to Brock and offered to shake his hand to make peace. But then he had deliberately crushed Lesnar's foot, who wasn't wearing shoes while Mr. Perfect was. In any case, whatever the origin of this story was, Brock ended up running after the veteran in the corridor of the plane. While at first they were grappling from a purely athletic perspective, it became more and more intense, and they got closer to the emergency exit. In this madness, Brock started to attack Mr. Perfect by ramming him against the emergency exit. They caused panic on board because Lesnar was putting a lot of energy into his attacks, and even if in theory the emergency exit was locked and impossible to open, people were afraid they would destroy the door and fall into the void, several miles above sea level, and other passengers could have even been sucked in. So we were very close to a disaster with potentially several deaths. Fortunately, they ended up being separated by Triple H, Finlay and Paul Heyman. This improvised wrestling fight on an airplane almost caused a drama, and it is something that management didn't like. So much so that Mr. Perfect will be fired from the company on May 7, 2002, just after this infamous flight. The Federation considered he was responsible for this incident, and unfortunately, he will die less than a year later, at only 44 years old from a cocaine overdose. If this story shocks you, wait to see the next ones that are much worse and that make this flight even more sulphurous. The worst is yet to come. Another case that took place on this plane during this flight over the Atlantic Ocean concerns the official Michael Hayes, who already had an important role behind the scenes at that time, and who was apparently not appreciated by the wrestlers. And we can say that on this day, Hayes clearly went too far. On this plane, where we imagine he had enjoyed the open bar, he was completely drunk and alcohol made him aggressive, noisy and obnoxious. According to witnesses, Michael Hayes even almost committed an absolutely mind-blowing act. He allegedly tried to pull his penis out of his pants and urinate on Linda McMahon, Vince's wife. We could learn that he was so intoxicated that he thought he was in the toilet, and he kept saying, "Wait a minute, wait a minute." Michael Hayes finally moved away, and in his alcoholic journey, if we can call it that, he saw that JBL, who would soon become one of the Ruthless Aggression era's best heels, was asleep in his armchair with a bandage on his head. The reason why he had this bandage is very simple. He just had a match at the Insurrection show against X-Pac in which he had bled. So seeing that, Hayes went to JBL shouting at him, "Hey you freaking redneck." And while JBL was sleeping and enjoying a well-deserved rest after his match, the official had the very bad idea of punching him right on his injury, right in his sleep. As you might expect, he started bleeding profusely again, and the suit that JBL was wearing ended up stained with blood. We can only imagine how unpleasant this awakening must have been for the Texan, and his reaction was proportional to what he had just suffered. He punched Michael Hayes, who was immediately knocked out, and who then remained asleep for many hours. And at that moment, it was time for revenge. X-Pac, who was also on the plane obviously, and also had enough of Hayes because he kept burying him in production meetings, asked for some scissors. And in front of a delirious audience who didn't believe he was going to do it, he cut Michael Hayes' mullet while he was sleeping. This mullet that the official had was now ancient history because of X-Pac, and the moment he had cut it, there was an explosion of joy among his colleagues on the plane. And apparently, when he got off the plane and when he was at customs, Hayes, who was still hungover, happened to see his reflection in a mirror while he was touching the back of his head. Suddenly, he was startled to discover his mullet was no longer there. Upon realizing this, he immediately returned to his normal state and was very angry, to a point where he even began to be vehement with the customs agents. In the end, no one denounced X-Pac, and during the following Raw, this piece of hair had been stuck on a wall in plain sight so that everyone would laugh at Michael Hayes' misfortunes. In the case of Scott Hall, who was also known as Razor Ramon, and who was a member of the famous NWO clan at World Championship Wrestling, what he did on this plane is a bit unclear given that Jim Ross, the best commentator of all time who was also in charge of talent relations, claims that Scott Hall wasn't involved in any major incident on this plane. Nevertheless, just like Mr. Perfect, he will be fired by the company in the wake of this infernal flight, after a last match on Raw on May 6th. So we can still wonder if he was really totally innocent in this story. First, we could learn that quite early in the flight, Scott was having fun putting shaving foam on his colleagues with Mr. Perfect. But then, what he apparently did, according to the allegations about him, was much less funny. When one of the flight attendants, Heidi Doyle, offered him a breakfast, Scott would have grabbed her by the shirt, telling her he was going to lick her vagina, which he would have tried to do just after that. In this same scene, he also allegedly ordered Taralyn Capilano, another flight attendant, to do him a sexual favor that you could easily guess. While Heidi was scared, all of a sudden Scott Hall lost consciousness and was completely out for the rest of the flight, to a point where people even checked if he was still alive. As for Heidi, she went to take refuge in the kitchen and didn't come out of it until landing, and you will see in a few minutes that this isn't the only hard moment she experienced on this plane. It should also be noted that Justin Credible played babysitter for Scott, including when getting off the plane, since at that moment, he was still completely out, and they even had to put him in a wheelchair when they were going through customs at the airport. We suspect that Vince McMahon must not have been delighted that the paparazzi, who were there to welcome them, saw one of his employees in a vegetative state, knowing that he was already on the hot seat because of his problems with alcohol. Apparently, one reason why he may have suddenly lost consciousness on this plane to finally wake up many hours later would be the triazolam that would have secretly slipped in his glass. It is a sleeping pill that wrestlers enjoyed making their colleagues take some without their knowledge so they would then be completely knocked out. Jim Ross even said you should never leave your drink unattended in the wrestling world because some people found it very funny to see their colleagues drooling and tripping just as they were trying to walk. It's a practice that can raise some questions, since it was done to make a joke to colleagues, but also to make women harmless and abuse them. As ECW legend Rob Van Dam said, it was kind of normal in some of the places I've been. Another wrestler who also caused a stir in this infernal flight is Dustin Rhodes, who we know in particular for his Goldust character, and who is Cody Rhodes' half-brother. And this behavior still cost him, since his contract will not be renewed in 2004, which the company had publicly announced, although he will eventually come back a few years later. We can say that during this flight, Dustin was quite paradoxical in his actions, probably because of alcohol. First, he would not have hesitated to pick one of the flight attendants up. Indeed, Taralyn Capilano told that the son of the legend Dusty Rhodes would tell him that they were going to have sex to stay correct. However, on this same flight, Dustin also had what looks like a moment of nostalgia and love for his ex-wife Terri Runnels, who was also on board. At one point, he managed to take control of the speakers on the plane, and he took the opportunity to sing a serenade for Terri. In this case, the song Pledging My Love by country singer David Allan Coe, doing some kind of remix of it. Obviously, this is something that woke up all the people who were sleeping, including Terri. She says she was really terrified when she heard this, knowing that they had been divorced for 3 years. At that moment, she looked at Paul Heyman, who was Brock Lesnar's on-screen manager at the time, and Paul motioned to her not to react to Dustin's serenade. He told her to no-sell it, a common term in wrestling used in this case in the idea of not reacting, not to get into his game. She then immediately went back to sleep, and Dustin Rhodes, meanwhile, was yelled at by Jim Ross, who made him stop and go to sleep. And in the end, Dustin also ended up devastated. A detail to highlight about Dustin Rhodes and Terri Runnels is that just before this flight, while they were in the locker room during the Insurrection show in the UK, they experienced a scene that was still quite significant concerning Brock Lesnar. According to Terri, she went to her ex-husband in the men's locker room to tell him something, and at that moment, she found herself facing Brock, who was sitting next to Dustin, and who had a towel around his waist. The Conqueror then opened the towel and showed Terri his penis. This is something she found extremely disrespectful, especially since she wasn't very impressed by Brock's penis, since apparently it was little and purple. She says she didn't want to report this incident because it would probably have caused her to lose her job, and she also said Vince McMahon was indeed on this plane, while Jonathan Coachman said that neither Vince nor Linda were there. The most infamous and controversial case about this flight concerns the nature boy Ric Flair, and it's important to get acquainted with this character before talking about what he was accused of. Of course, Flair is above all one of the greatest legends of the sports entertainment industry, the one who was a 16-time world champion and who was a mentor to wrestlers like Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Batista, Randy Orton, and others. Not to mention all those he inspired with his arrogant heel character who loved luxury and flaunting all his wealth. And we can say this character totally corresponded to how he was in real life for many years. For example, Jim Ross said about him, "Being on the road with Flair was like a never-ending party. He had two great passions in ring wrestling and his social life. He was always the life of the party, so if you traveled with him on the road, you kind of agreed to those terms." The commentator also told that Ric Flair was the type of guy to pay for limousine rides, be in first-class flights, party until the morning with a very big alcohol consumption. Apparently, the nature boy used to arrive at hotel bars and order drinks for everyone, usually a kamikaze, his favorite drink, a cocktail with vodka triple sec, and lime juice. People who didn't know him, and who had either heard of his Four Horsemen faction, were generally sure to remember him when the party was over, when the sun was rising. And it should be noted that Flair was dancing with everyone's wives, and that his nightlife was so intense to follow that it caused a limo driver in Chicago to have a fatal heart attack. Apparently, the latter had to pick up Flair at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and drop him off at 8 o'clock in the morning for 3 days, and the driver died in his sleep the day after Rick and his friends left the city. And yet, what is absolutely incredible is that even though he hardly slept, drank a lot, until the end of the night, he went to the gym the next morning and had the best matches of the shows every night. At one time, Rick also used to say on the air where his Four Horsemen clan was going to spend the night and invite all the women to come there, knowing that husbands and boyfriends were not allowed. Apparently, it has already happened that more than 300 women arrive in the lobby of a hotel where they were, a lifestyle that has often destroyed the different marriages of the nature boy. He was in his second marriage at the time of this infernal flight, and in this case it was Charlotte Flair's mother. But that day, on the plane, Rick was in a playful mood because he did something there that some of his colleagues said he used to do, to walk around in the airplane corridor wearing only one of his famous robes and be completely naked underneath. And at that moment, his little game was to open his robe in front of people by doing his iconic woo and proudly show off his penis, even going so far as to doing the helicopter with it. And the stewardesses on the plane were therefore entitled to it. And that's where Ric Flair would have gone too far. At the moment when the hostess Heidi was in the kitchen, Rick would have come to get a drink, but right after, he would have forced Heidi to touch his penis and licked her face while she asked him to stop. These incidents will push the two hostesses to file a complaint against Flair for sexual assault. According to the nature boy himself, there would be no truth behind these accusations, although they would eventually had an agreement with the two women so that the case would not end in court. This case had consequences for Flair since the Federation, faced with this scandal around the nature boy, when the Dark Side of the Ring documentary about this flight was released, decided to remove him from the signature at the beginning of the show in which we could hear his famous woo. Flair said it was one of the hardest things in his life, having several thousand people tell him at the same time, in September 2021, that he was no longer in the opening of Raw and SmackDown after the release of the documentary, which is a pile of bullcrap about him in his eyes. The nature boy considered this an attempt to erase his legacy, even if his woo returned in the signature of the show in the summer of 2022. In any case, according to former official and wrestling specialist Jim Cornette, Flair had absolutely no bad intentions in his actions with these women and didn't realize that it was wrong. Anyway, this sexual assault case involving the nature boy is clearly the biggest scandal around this infernal flight, as the symbol of these incidents mixing depravity, alcohol, and violence over the Atlantic Ocean. When we take a step back on everything that happened on that plane in May 2002, we can quote what Jim Ross had written on the WWE website shortly after. He who was supposed to manage talents relations and who felt helpless by finding himself in a babysitting role for men who seemed unable to manage themselves. Here is what he wrote. The flight was about 7 hours in length, and at times was low lighted by a handful of people who consumed too much alcohol and consequently acted like children whose parents were away and left the liquor cabinet unlocked. And it's true that when we read these comments from Jim, we ask ourselves questions. Should he have kept this situation under control more? Was it his responsibility to make sure wrestlers didn't take pills and drank much less alcohol? And more generally, was it a good idea to have a plane just for them with a lot of alcohol? These are real questions that arise, and we can even go further. Many wrestlers had addictions and fell into vices, also because the lifestyle was infernal. We are indeed talking about a global era when the treatment of injuries was different, when wrestlers were not yet surrounded by doctors and where there were no concussion protocols yet, where internal competition was tough. We could think that addictions, which are actually loopholes, and their consequences was something inevitable for wrestlers at the time because the life imposed on them was so hard. Should they have had a less extreme schedule where they don't wrestle every day and been more taken care of in terms of health by their employers? Also remembering that this is not specific to WWE since all this was normal in the wrestling world for several decades. Would these scandals have happened with modern conditions, for example, where there is more emphasis on the safety and health of performers? In any case, Justin Credible, who was one of the wrestlers on the plane, says that Vince McMahon could have been in a lot more trouble regarding this infernal flight, that someone could have died on this plane. But who is to blame in this story? The wrestlers who can't manage themselves and who no longer realize the consequences of their actions? Or the company who put them into a lifestyle that was already harmful to make as much money as possible? All these questions are legit when we look at this scandal. But what is absolutely mind-blowing is that the co-creator of Dark Side of the Ring said that the feeling among the wrestlers was that if we found this plane ride from hell shocking and wild, we should have seen other flights they were on. Apparently, there would have been many other infernal flights, and even worse than this one. As for X-Pac, he says, for example, that everything that happened on this plane is not even in the 10 craziest flights he has experienced, which were in addition commercial flights, so with normal passengers. He talks in particular about wrestlers with the laces of their shoes on fire. If a flight with several people completely out because of drugs and alcohol, with fights and especially sexual assaults apparently, is not even one of the craziest he has experienced, what were the other flights like? What other excesses have been common in the wrestling world for years, at a time when there were not smartphones and social media, and where everything was therefore not known? Clearly, this is a terrible idea, and it can remind us when the murder that Jimmy Snuka had committed was covered up by the company, or when we could learn from the mouth of veteran Brutus Beefcake that Shawn Michaels and his colleague Marty Jannetty apparently used to drug women to rape them in their hotel rooms and then throw them in the hallway completely naked. In any case, these incidents like the ones in May 2002 do damage. When the crew had to clean the plane at the end of the flight, there was blood on the floor, vomit, syringes. As for Heidi Doyle, one of the hostesses who has therefore apparently been a victim of these wrestlers' behaviors, when she returned to the hotel, she tells that she cried in the shower. She had just recently been a mother and told her husband about the whole situation, wondering if she had done anything that she shouldn't have done, and that attracted the wrestlers' attention too much. When she wanted to tell her employer what she had suffered, she was told that what had happened to her was unfortunate, but that it was preferable to keep everything to herself since they work with athletes and things can happen. Her employer was keen to respect the privacy of its clients. With Tarolin Capilano, they ended up filing a complaint against the Stamford Federation and its employees Ric Flair, Scott Hall and Dustin Rhodes in 2004, and reached an agreement with the company. Almost 20 years later, in the Dark Side of the Ring documentary, Heidi Doyle still seemed affected by this infernal flight. While for these flight attendants this experience had been traumatic, for Ric Flair and others, it seemed like a random day that was forgotten right after. How can we ignore these awful backstage scenes when we think back to the legacy of Nature Boy, for example, who has achieved great things in his career and who is among the best of all time, without the shadow of a doubt? And it is really by seeing the psychological repercussions on normal people as well as on the health of the wrestlers themselves and their own loved ones that we understand even more the impact of incidents like those on this plane. And this is how our documentary about the plane ride from hell scandal ends. As we saw, it is an infamous case in wrestling that had direct consequences on the careers of several veterans, and that has left traces, even years later. When we learn that in reality, there would have already been much worse plane trips, we wonder how far some wrestlers went in depravity and vice at that time when the business was more popular than ever, and when it was much easier to keep it secret than today. There were no platforms on the web where the victims could tell everything or smartphones so that anyone could film an incident at any time. In the end, maybe this infernal flight over the Atlantic is a rather soft symbol of all the sins of the industry for years in the dark side of wrestling. We might be tempted to do a comparison with the current generation of wrestlers and say that there has been a step forward in terms of backstage behaviors compared to previous generations, but I come to offer you a debate about it. In your opinion, have these excesses among wrestlers in terms of drug use, alcohol, and sexual practices completely disappeared? Do you think the current roster has somehow been purified of vice and depravity, or do you think it still exists but completely out of sight with much more precautions? Come and give your opinion in the comments. I wonder what you think about it. We can say that this plane ride was really outrageous. I hope you had a good time watching this video, and I invite you to stay on the paradise of wrestling to look at some other ones. See you right away.
And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so. What?